Chapter 27. The Bridge of the Giants. There is no busier place in Derry than the stretch of quays along the river, and one may see ships there not only from England and Belgium and France, but from Australia and Argentina and India and Brazil. The river is wide and deep, with a channel carefully marked by a line of buoys extending clear out into Lough Foyle. But there are no better facilities here for shipping than at any one of half a dozen ports along the western coast, all of which are silent and deserted. For a port is of no use unless there is something to ship out of it in exchange for the things which are shipped in, or money to pay for them, and there is neither in the west of Ireland. And, just as there is no more dismal sight than a line of deserted quays, so there is no more interesting sight than a line of busy ones, and we loitered for a long time next morning along those of Derry, on our way to the Midland station, on the other side of the river. There is a big iron bridge across the river just above the quays, but that seemed a long way around, so when we came to a signboard announcing a ferry, we stopped. My first thought was that the ferry boat was on the other side. Then I perceived a small motor-propelled skiff moored beside the quay, and one of the two men in it asked me if we were looking for the ferry, and I said yes, and he said that was it. So we clambered down into the boat and started off. And I scarcely think that the trip paid, for we were the only passengers, and the river is wide, and gasoline is expensive, and somebody had to pay the men their wages, and the fare is only a penny. The part of the town which lies east of the river is industrial and unattractive. There are some big distilleries there, and a lot of mills and a fish market, and row upon row of dingy dwellings. But the biggest building of all is the workhouse, one point at least in which the towns of the north resemble those of the south. There is another point too, the jail, without which no Irish town is complete. Derry has one of which it is very proud, the latest word in jails in fact, a great circular affair, with the cells arranged in so-called panoptic galleries, that is, in such a fashion that the guard stationed in the centre of the jail yard can see into all of them. But we had crossed the river not to see the town which lay beyond it, but to take train for Portrush, and we were soon rolling northward close beside the bank of the river, with a splendid view of the Maiden Honour Hill Boys on the opposite shore, dominated by the cathedral tower and Walker's White Monument. Just before the river begins to widen into the loch, the train passes the ruins of an old castle of the O'Dohertys, standing on a point which juts out into the water, a castle which saw rather more than its share of siege and sally. For this is Coolmore, which was always the first point of attack when any expedition advanced against Derry. Beyond it, the water widens, and on the farther shore, which is Inishowen, there are pretty villas, standing in luxuriant woods, the homes of some of Derry's wealthy citizens. Then the train turned inland across a stretch of country so flat and carefully cultivated that it might have been Holland. And then the hills began to crowd closer and closer to the shore, until the train was running along its very edge, under precipitous crags, past grotesque pinnacles of white chalk or black basalt, and fantastic caverns worn in the cliffs by the centuries-long action of the waves. For that stretch of blue water stretching away to the north, so calm and beautiful, was the Atlantic, and it thunders in upon this coast sometimes, with the fury even the rocks cannot withstand. We turned away from it at last, up the wide estuary of the River Bann, and so we came to Coleraine, chiefly connected in my mind with that beautiful Kitty, who, while tripping home from the fair one morning with a pitcher of buttermilk, looked at Barney McCleary instead of at the path, and stumbled and let the pitcher drop. But, instead of crying over the spilt milk, accepted philosophically the kiss which Barney gave her, with the result that, very soon after poor Kitty's disaster, the div of the pitcher was whole in Coleraine. Among the innumerable other laws for which Lloyd George is responsible, there is one requiring all the shopkeepers of the United Kingdoms to close their places of business one afternoon every week in order to give their employees a short vacation. And in every town, the shopkeepers get together and decide which afternoon it shall be. And if you arrive in the town on that afternoon, you will find every shop closed tight, often to your great inconvenience. It was Thursday afternoon when we reached Coleraine, and Thursday is closing day there. And we found that not only were the shops closed, but the train schedule was so altered that we had a long wait ahead of us. But we were richly compensated for the delay, for, as we started out to explore the town, we saw written chalk on a wall just outside the station, "To hell with the Pope," and under it, in another hand, "To hell with King Billy," and in a third hand it added, "God save King Will, no more Pope." I had heard, of course, that the accepted retort for Catholics to make, when the Pope was insulted, was to consign William of Orange to the infernal regions. But such a retort seemed so weak and ineffective that I could hardly believe in its reality. Yet, here it was, and some Orangemen had paused long enough to add what is probably the usual third article of the controversy. What the fourth article is, I can't guess. Perhaps it is at this point that the cudgels rise and the rocks begin to fly. And it seems to me characteristic of Ireland that the Catholic, in this case, instead of erasing the offending sentence, should have let it stand and answered it in kind. Cheered and heartened by this encounter, we walked on to look at Coleraine, but found it an uninteresting manufacturing town, with nothing in it of historical importance, for it is one of the plantations made by the London companies some time after 1613. It was closed as tightly that afternoon as on a Sunday, and we soon wearied of looking at ugly houses and silent factories, and made our way back to the station, meditating upon that black day for the Irish when this whole county, having been duly confiscated, was made over by royal edict to the 100 London adventurers whose heirs or assigns still own it. Yet the conquest had one advantage. The O'Dohertys and the O'Cahans knew only the arts of war. The newcomers brought with them the arts of peace. One of them was distilling, and the Irish had never drunk such whisky as the Coleraine, which was produced here in the succeeding years. There is no more popular story in this region than that of the priest who was preaching a temperance sermon, and, after pointing out the evils of overindulgence, continued with great earnestness, "And me boys, 'tis the bad stuff you be taking that does the worst of the mischief. I never touch a drop myself, but the best Coleraine." We got away from Coleraine at last, and ran northward toward the sea again, across uneven sand drifts, past Port Stewart, where Charles Lever was once a dispensary doctor, and occupied his leisure hours, which were many, in setting down the adventures of Harry Lorriker. And then the road ran on, close beside the sea to Port Rush, with its pleasant beach and rock-bound bathing pool, which was full of people on this holiday. But Port Rush is a place of summer hotels, so we did not linger there, but transferred quickly to the electric line, which runs on to the Giant's Causeway, 14 miles away. This line was established in 1883, and so is the oldest electric road in the world. And I judge that it is still using the cars it started out with. At least, the two which composed the train that day were exceedingly primitive. One was open and the other was closed, and you took your choice. We chose the open one, of course, on the side overlooking the sea. And presently we started through the town, a man ringing a bell with one hand and waving a flag with the other, preceding us to make certain the track was clear. The bell, I suppose, is for blind people, and the flag for deaf people, and the fact that the man is armed with both proves how thorough the Irish can be when they really put their minds to it. Although the line has been in operation for 30 years, it is still evidently regarded with fear and wonder by the people who live along it. Time was when the power was conveyed by means of the third rail, so common in the United States. With us, however, the rail is only used along a guarded right-of-way. Here it was exposed close up by the fence at the roadside, and though it was well out of the way, it was nevertheless stumbled over by many men and beasts, with the usual result. There were many protests, and in the course of 15 or 20 years, the Board of Trade was moved to investigate. The evidence of the hearing was most conflicting. The people of the neighbourhood asserted that their lives were in constant danger. The company, on the other hand, claimed that no sober man would ever step on the rail, since to get to it, he had to cross the tracks. The people of the neighbourhood protested indignantly against this reflection upon their habits, and asked triumphantly if the horses and cows and other poor beasts that were killed were also drunk. The company retorted that, so far as the horses and cows were concerned, it was the practice of the natives, for miles around, whenever they had an animal about to die, to lead, or if it was unable to walk, to haul it to the railway, and prop it against the fence with a foot on the rail, and then to demand compensation for its death. There was, perhaps, a grain of truth in this, but the board nevertheless ordered the company to take up the rail and substitute an overhead wire for it, and this has been done. The only way the natives can get damages now is to inveigle a car to run into them, and this is well nigh impossible, for the cars are run very slowly and carefully, and at every curve there is a signal cabin where a watchful guard, armed with a red flag and a white one, keeps careful eyes upon the track. We were just gathering speed outside the town when we saw in a nearby field an aggregation whose builds had attracted our attention more than once in our journeyings about Ireland. It was Buff Bill's circus, and the picturesqueness of its lithographs had made us most anxious to see it. Here it was at last, and it consisted of 3 tiny tents and 1 van and 3 or 4 horses, and 5 or 6 people who, at this moment, were eating their midday meal, seated on the ground above a sheet iron stove, while the youngsters of the neighbourhood looked on. I am sorry we did not get to see the show, for I am sure we should have enjoyed it. Then the road mounted to a terrace high above the sea, and the views over coast and water were superb. The effects of erosion are especially fantastic, and the line passes fretted spires, and yawning caverns, and deep gullies, and mighty arches, all worn in the chalk and basalt cliffs by the ceaseless action of the waves. And at one place there is a grotesque formation which does indeed, as may be seen from the picture opposite, resemble a giant's head. And there is one most picturesque ruin, for, 10 miles out from Port Rush, all that is left of Dunluce Castle overhangs the sea from the summit of a precipitous rock, separated from the mainland by a deep chasm. The chasm is 20 feet wide, and in days of old there was a drawbridge over it. But the bridge has disappeared, and now there is just an arch of masonry about 2 feet wide, and without protection of any sort. It takes a steady head to cross it, but the Irish are fond of just such breakneck bridges. The castle itself, with its roofless gables and jagged walls, seems a part of the rock on which it is built. It is said to possess a banshee, and one can well believe it. Dunluce is interesting, because it was once a stronghold of the Scotch invaders, who succeeded in conquering all this northeast coast of Ireland from here around to Carlingford Lough, away below Belfast. Scotland is only a few miles away across the North Channel. One can see its coast on a clear day from the cliffs above Benmore, and it was natural enough that there should be sailing back and forth. Owen, First Lord of Tyrone, brought a wife from Scotland, that Alloch, after whom he named his fortress. And they had many children, one of whom went back to Scotland and became the head of that princedom whose chief afterwards called himself Lord of the Isles. In Ireland the family was O'Donnell, but in Scotland the members of Clan Donnell were not O's but Macs. Angus MacDonald married a daughter of the great house of O'Coghan, and by this means and by that, the Scotch gradually won a foothold on the Irish coast and built castles up and down it. And finally, in a pitched battle, defeated the Irish who had held the land about Dunluce and had built this castle here. It was besieged and captured after that, once by the Irish under Shane O'Neill, and once by the English under Sir John Perrott, and during the troubled times of the Commonwealth and Restoration, fell into ruins and was never restored, partly, no doubt, because it was no longer safe. For one night in 1639 there was a great party in the castle, and a storm arose, and the waves dashed against the rock below it, and suddenly part of the rock gave way, and carried the kitchen and 8 servants down into the abyss. Just beyond the castle, the road rounds a point and runs down into the valley of the Bush River, where stands the little town of Bushmills, known all over the world because of the whisky which is made there. And then it passes a great house on a cliff overlooking the sea, Runkerry Castle. And then high up on the slope ahead loom 2 big hotels, and the tram stops, for this is the causeway. Both the hotels of the causeway are owned by the same man, but each maintains its runner, and each runner makes a lively bid for your custom. And then, when you have made your choice and started toward it, you will suddenly be conscious of a rough voice speaking over your shoulder, and you will turn to find a man striding at your heels, a man unshaven and clad in nondescript clothes. And if you listen very attentively, you will presently understand that he is offering to guide you about the causeway. Everybody in the vicinity of the causeway makes his living off the people who visit it, and the favourite profession is that of guide. Now a guide is wholly unnecessary, for a broad road leads directly to the causeway, and once there, it is simply a question of using one's eyes. But, from the persistence of the guides, one would think there was great danger of getting lost, or of falling overboard, or of experiencing some other horrible misfortune, if one ventured there unattended. Every guide carries also in his waistcoat pocket one or more fossils, which he found himself and prizes very highly, but is willing to sell for a small sum, as a personal favour. When his supply is exhausted, he goes and buys some more from the syndicate, which ships them in quantity. For it should be remembered that the causeway is as strictly organised for profit, and as carefully exploited, as is Killarney. As soon as we had arranged for our room, we set off for the causeway, running the gauntlet of guides posted on both sides of the road. Then a man with a pony cart wanted to drive us to our destination, and one would have thought from the way he spoke that it was a long and trying journey. Then we refused 3 or 4 offers of fossils and postcards. And finally, we found ourselves alone on a road which swept round the edge of a great amphitheatre of cliff. And the face of that cliff is worth examining, for it is formed of the lava flow from some long extinct crater. And the successive flows, separated by the so-called ochre beds, or strata of dark red volcanic ash, can be plainly distinguished. The road gradually drops until it is quite near the sea, and then it passes a number of shanties, from which old women issue to waylay the passer-by with offers of fossils and postcards and various curios. And then the visitor is confronted by a high wire fence, beyond which, if he looks closely, he will see a little neck of land running out into the water, and that is the celebrated Giant's Causeway. It is so small and so seemingly insignificant that Betty and I stared at it through the fence with a distinct shock of disappointment. Then we went on to the gate, paid the 6pence which is extorted from every visitor, registered ourselves in the turnstile, and entered. The misfortune of the causeway is that its fame is too great. The visitor, expecting to see something magnificent and grandiose, is rather dashed at first to find out how small it is. But, after a few minutes wandering over the queer columns of basalt, this feeling passes, and one begins to realise that it is really one of the wonders of the world. I am not going to describe it. Everyone has seen photographs of it, or, if anyone hasn't, he will find some opposite this page, and the photographs picture it much better than I can. There are some 40,000 of the pillars, the guidebook says. 5-sided or 6-sided for the most part, averaging, I should say, about 15 inches in diameter, and so close together that a lead pencil is too thick to be thrust between them. The pillars are divided into regular worm-like segments, some 6 or 8 inches thick, and there are quite a lot of segments lying about, broken off from the columns. The whole bed is said by geologists to be nothing but a lava flow, which broke up into these columnar shapes when it cooled and contracted. The native Irish have a far better explanation than that. In the old days, the mighty Finn MacCool, annoyed at the boasting of a Caledonian rival on the hills across the channel, invited him to step over and see which was the better man. And the giant said he would be glad to come over and show Finn a thing or two, if it wasn't for wetting his feet. So Finn, in a rage, built a causeway right over to Scotland, and the Scotch giant came across on it. And of course Finn beat him well, for this is an Irish legend. But, with that generosity which has always been the characteristic of Irishmen after they have whipped their opponents, he permitted his humble rival to choose a wife from the many fair girls of the neighbourhood, and to build him a house and settle down. Which the Scotch giant was very glad to do, for everyone knows that the Scotch women are rough and hard-bitten. Also that Scotland is a land of mist and snow, not fair like Ireland, which has always been the loveliest country in the world. And presently, since the causeway wasn't needed anymore and impeded navigation, Finn gave it a kick with the foot of him and sunk it in the sea, all but this little end against the Irish coast. And there it stands unto this day, to witness if I lie. Whatever you think of the causeway, you will certainly be impressed when you pass out between the clustered columns of the Giant's Gateway, and start on the walk under the beetling cliffs beyond. The narrow path mounts up and up, under overhanging masses of columnar stone, which all too evidently crashes down from time to time, for there are great piles of debris below, and the path is either swept away in places, or recently repaired. So most visitors hurry past with one eye upward, and the other contemplating the beauty of the scene below. At least we did. And then we came out at Chimney Point, crowned with its chimney-like columns, a mass of basalt on top of a red ochre bed. And here there was a seat where we sat down to contemplate one of the most impressive views in Ireland. A combination of blue sea and white surf and black crag and columned cliff, not soon to be forgotten. We went on at last, around the point of the cliff, where the path overhangs the depths below and is guarded by an iron railing. On and on, past clusters of columns named looms or organ pipes, or whatever Irish fancy may have suggested. And at last we turned slowly back, and spent another half-hour at the causeway, hunting out the wishing chair, and the Giant's Cannon, and Lord Antrim's parlour, all of which may easily be found. And then we took a drink from the Giant's Well, a spring of pure cold water bubbling up from among the rocks. And so back to the hotel, and to dinner.